Good afternoon, folks. I'm Michelle DiMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum. Welcome to our last virtual Art in Focus of 2025, where we will be taking a look together at this painting that is in the Bellarmine Hall Galleries on the campus of Fairfield University. As always, we invite you, if you're in the area, to please stop by. Our Bellarmine Hall Galleries will be open until December 20th with our Monument Show, if you were watching our last virtual Art in Focus. Open till December 20th, and we're open Tuesday through Saturday, 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., and until 8 o'clock every Thursday. Our Walsh Gallery show is closing this Saturday, so if you have not yet seen Stitching Time, you're going to want to get there before the show closes 4 o'clock this Saturday, December 13th. Our focus today, though, this painting at the left is Paolo Fiammingo's Adoration of the Shepherds from toward the end of the 16th century, an oil on canvas painting. And this was one of we can call the founding paintings of the Fairfield University Art Museum. In fact, as I was just telling the group of guests who joined us for the in-person version of this at 12 noon, this painting arrived on Fairfield the same semester that I arrived on Fairfield. It came to the university from the collection of what was known as the Museum of Art, Science, and Industry in Bridgeport, which was turning into more of the Science Museum. Today it's the Discovery Museum. They did not need their 10 European Renaissance and Baroque paintings any longer, and Dr. Philip Eliasov stepped in to scoop them up for Fairfield. So it has been here for quite a while, and now it is part of the Fairfield University Art Museum, which opened in 2010. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the institution, we are just 15 years old. And it is the largest of our 10 Kress paintings, always hanging unassumingly in the back part of the gallery. And I have to say, it was such a pleasure to do the in-person version of this today, because as with every one of the Art in Focus events, sitting with a group of people in front of an artwork is a very different experience than looking at it on a screen or even standing in front of it, because I always find that I notice new things, not only from the observations and questions posed by our visitors, but also just from the physical position where I am, probably different from how I'm usually encountering it as I move through the gallery. But noticing sort of the changes that our environment or even the technology can have on what we're looking at for this painting started before the in-person, because this morning I'm looking at this we have a running set of digital boards, advertisements that run in the hallway. And I was noticing that the advertising images for this seemed so much more bright and vibrant than the image that's on screen, which is the high resolution image that a professional photographer shot for us. And, then I went into the gallery and I took a photo with my cell phone that you're seeing on the right. And I was struck by how different the two photographs came out. Now, a lot of this can be down to the kind of lenses and lighting. And, there's so many factors going into play in taking images of an artwork. But just if you look at the color of the sleeve of the gentleman who has his back to us, you can see it's a much richer shade of green than the image on the left would lead you to believe. And I showed this photograph or this pairing to my colleague Heather, and she immediately remarked, like, the sky in the image on the right, it's so much more blue, it's so much more vibrant. So with some irony, the image on the left is much higher resolution since it was taken by a different professional photographer, but I am actually going to use my own, I don't know what this is, an iPhone 12 or 13. It's not a recent phone by any means. And you're getting, since I have taken this gallery shot, you're getting that edge of the glare from the lights at the very top edge of the painted surface. But this is a little bit closer to the experience we were having in the gallery, which is why I'm using the one that I am. So one of the other things that we was a lot of discussion in the gallery is the title of this painting. Because I'd mentioned to the group that was gathered, when I started working at Fairfield, the museum was referring to this painting as Nativity. That was the title we were using for it. And a couple of years ago, we shifted gears and we started referring to it as an Adoration of the Shepherds. And when it comes to paintings from this time period, it's very rare that we're really talking about a title specifically given by the artist and intended to always remain with that object. I mean, even Mona Lisa, the most famous Western painting, that's just the name of the woman who's in it. Usually they are nicknames, sometimes nicknames based on who might have owned a painting in the past, or just a nickname on the kind of scene that is being shown. So there are a set of images that take place, in the Christian sense around this time of year. And that would be the Nativity, it would be the Adoration of the Shepherds, the Adoration of the Visit of the Three Magi. All of these are stories around the birth of Jesus. And there's always going to be a little bit of, shall we say, slippage or ambiguity between them, depending on what each individual artist has decided to include. So in the painting that we're looking at together, closest to us, we have three figures. On the left, we have a man in brown who's kneeling, who has his hands crossed over his chest, and he's looking down at a rather indistinctly painted baby Jesus in the manger, or in a little thing stuffed with hay lying on a white sheet. A little bit further back, we have the Virgin Mary, who has her hands clasped in front of her and is lightly bending over the Christ child. And then there's the man at the right with his back to us, has a voluminous yellow cloak, has one hand and finger raised. And we'll come back to him in a moment. In fact, I have a close up there. You can probably already tell that the resolution is starting to give way, and that is not because of the painting as much as it's because of my cell phone camera being used to take the shot. But something that has always stuck out to me about this painting that I enjoy about it is the very thick and buttery brushstrokes that the artist used, particularly on the yellow cloak of the gentleman at the right. But you can also make it out on the garments of the woman who's standing behind the kneeling man in brown, where we see those highlights on the pink, on the green, on the white. Those are a real treat to look at in person, and a reminder of where we are finding ourselves in the world of the Renaissance. Paolo Fiammingo is an artist from Northern Europe who had come down to Venice and apprenticed with the Tintoretto family. And he had a different last name, but as Italians tended to do, everyone just nicknamed him, oh, the guy from Flanders. That's how he becomes Paolo Fiammingo, just another nickname, much like the nicknames of the paintings themselves. One of the things Venetian artists were known for in the Renaissance was very much this attitude toward paint, just a pure enjoyment in the handling of paint. A fun adjective that art historians use is painterly, which you might think is a contradiction in that wouldn't any brushstroke laid down by a painter by definition be painterly? When we use it, we are tending to describe brushstrokes like those visible on this yellow cloak that are visible, that play with whether they are delineating form or merely representing their own evidence of paint that has been drawn and laid onto the canvas. A Central Italian artist from the same time period, for example, an artist like Raphael, who worked in Florence and in Rome, they might have taken greater care to sort of conceal their work, remove visible evidence of the extensive brushwork on the surface so that nothing would distract you from the illusion of what we're seeing. Artists in Venice, where this artist trained, Fiammingo, they started to see the pleasure of the interplay between the oil paint and the thick weave of the canvas underneath. So definitely repays if you are visiting the Fairfield University Art Museum. Do come up and take a close look at this painting because it's just a pleasure to watch. But the more you look at these figures in the front, and I was gratified that our guests immediately cottoned on that there's just a lot of ambiguity here. And the ambiguity lies not only in the figures and their relationship to each other, perhaps even into their identity and their role in this story, and also the space that they occupy and the spaces that are around them. And the first person we started with was just this gentleman with his back to us to the right. And I said this painting is called The Adoration of the Shepherds. We discussed the identity of who this gentleman might be. And someone said, as I have kind of always assumed, that, well, this must be St. Joseph. If we're looking at the Virgin Mary, the newborn Jesus, who else would make sense, would be an older man who'd be present at the scene? St. Joseph. But immediately this was contradicted by one member of our group who said, well, I think he's another shepherd. And as she's saying that, I'm like, okay, I see that, he's got a collar poking out of his robe, the same as this guy does on the left. And her point was simply that, well, how can you call this Adoration of the Shepherds if you've only got one shepherd in the form of the man in brown? And first we laughed. I'm like, well, fair. Should we rename it, Adoration of the Shepherd, singular? And she said, no. I think the gentleman on the right is another shepherd. And she interpreted his physical position as he is slowly sinking one knee to the ground to genuflect before the baby, which is really interesting because, as I said, I've always looked at this and sort of assumed, well, it's St. Joseph. But what she said about there being just one shepherd, let me just say that in this conversation over the course of half an hour, we identified potentially multiple shepherds, maybe in that group that is behind the people that we're looking at. Maybe you'll come to the same conclusion. But it was just a reminder that, I just made my own assumption. There are no There's no caste list attached to the back of this painting. I don't think we can dispute the identity of the woman in the blue cloak or the infant, but pretty much everyone else here is potentially up for iconographic grabs, so to speak. That said, one thing that might contradict this idea that the gentleman in yellow is a fellow shepherd is that voluminous yellow cloak, which is not matched by the gentleman in brown on the left. Now, if the cloak was fully covering him, we wouldn't be able to see anything of what he's wearing underneath. But the way it's falling off his shoulder, you can see, in fact, a vibrant green sleeve. We see more of a yellow, maybe a tunic over the sleeve. I see the white of a shirt popping out from underneath it, and maybe one knee that is green as opposed to the other that is covered in the voluminous cloak. And then we look at the gentleman on the left, no cloak, garbed entirely in brown. His socks, his breeches are red. He wears black leather shoes. He has a soft looking hat lying on the ground. And although I've cut it off slightly in this detail, in the full image, you might be able to see he has a cane or a walking stick that is extending out the bottom left-hand side of the picture. So at the very least, that guy looks like he's come from a far distance, the guy on the left, the guy in brown. The only similarity I find between the man in brown and the man with the yellow robe is the presence of the collar, which I will admit, the gentleman I had been thinking of as St. Joseph, it's not very biblical looking to have a collar poking out. Usually we see them just sort of swathed in fabric. So that did make me notice him a little bit differently. But nonetheless, he doesn't look as starkly contemporary to the world in which this painting was created as the man in brown. And perhaps nothing about his clothes says this as much as what you might be able to make out about his facial hair. The man in brown, he has close cropped brown hair, and on his face, an unmistakable little uptick of a mustache, or I baffi, as the Italians would call them. And Joe, one of our visitors in the gallery, he said, it's reminding me of an artist. And I said, is it Salvador Dali? And he said, yes. Now, Salvador Dali had those really long mustachios, but this gentleman has the upticked edge of a mustache. That alone would tell us this is not someone who is coming out of the same time period as Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. That is a distinct sign of someone from the 16th century. And you look closely at his clothes and you say, yes, knee breeches and a tunic and the shirt. This is someone who has come from the time period of the painter. And members of our group said, okay, maybe it is Fiammingo. Maybe this is a self-portrait. It's possible. The other common probability in a painting like this, when you have a Christian religious scene and then there's someone from our world breaking, I almost said breaking containment, but appearing inside it, is that that could be the donor, the person who paid for the painting to be made. And as part of that payment, they are allowed to have their features represented. And then that gives them not only a representation of their features for posterity, but their features represented in an act of piety. And we see this a lot in Renaissance paintings, and of course, even earlier, people showing up in scenes where they don't actually fit chronologically, but they are then represented as part of the religious narrative itself. So it's possible that this gentleman is a patron. It's very possible that those are the features of a real 16th century man. Unfortunately, because we know almost nothing about the ownership history of this painting prior to 1939, we will likely never know his identity, nor will we probably ever know the name of the original patron, where it was designed to hang, any of the kind of information that we might otherwise be able to use to come to a little bit of a better conclusion. And by the way, if you're watching this live, you're more than welcome to jump in the comments with your observations about the painting. But going back to our sense of ambiguities, there's this question of, are both of these men from the same time period? It's definite that the man from the brown is from the 16th century. The man in the yellow cloak, maybe. I'd always assumed he's part of the biblical group, but I had a seed of doubt planted in me by one of our participants. Ambiguous as well is the body positions of several of these people. Least ambiguous is the man in brown. We can see one knee bent. I can see both of his shoes. I understand this is as a gesture of reverence. The Virgin Mary we had a little discussion about because some folks insisted that she could not possibly be kneeling. I said, no, I see a highlight on a knee. I think, in fact, she is being represented kneeling. There's something about her proportions that don't quite seem correct. She seems very long for a woman who is kneeling. Or rather, if she rose, she would seem extremely tall, especially considering she's a little bit further back in the painting than the other two figures. And then the guy on the right. Now, I mentioned that someone had said, oh, well, he's sliding down to genuflect like the man on the other side. That actually made much more sense than how I'd always seen him sort of ambiguously perched in midair. Now, note that the foot that we can see, he really only has his toes touching the ground. One knee is then angled downward. The other knee is 90 degrees. We can see that next to Mary's cloak. Where is his butt? Like, what is supporting this man in midair? Even his right hand is sort of ambiguous. It's garbed in the yellow robes. It seems maybe like it's leaning on a bit of wood as an outcropping, but it seems very unstable, very dynamic, we could say. So I like this idea that he's sort of poised in the middle of making a change in position. But all of that, and we haven't even gotten past the people who are in the lower portion of the painting. But as we move upwards beyond Mary's head, we have the addition of this serving woman at the left, or I should say serving person. We had some disagreement about whether we're looking at a male figure or a female figure. Then we discussed what we thought might be in the basket on the person's head. And again, I found my sort of casual assumption challenged by something a visitor said. I had always seen that semicircular or the circular sort of round shape as a wide-mouthed terracotta jug of some kind in that basket carried on this woman's head. And someone else said, no, 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 it's loaves of bread stacked on top of each other. And that's why the napkin is there. Now, you can use a napkin for a wine jar, but I don't think there's any way to say positively either way. Is it two loaves of bread stacked? Is it a terracotta vessel? Is it something other that we have not considered at all? I was interested to see, based on some past interactions in front of this painting with students, what our visitors might make of what the person down and to the right of the serving person. We have someone with a red headgear that has something thrown over his shoulder. We see he has his sleeves rolled up, so he's working hard. There's another man behind him with a cap that seems to be sort of head turned, looking toward him. And I was gratified that this time, almost immediately, someone said, "Oh, well, that's an animal." Because in the past, there's been discussion over, is that a sack of rice or of wheat, something thrown over the shoulder? If you look very carefully, you might be able to make out over behind his back a little face, and there's a tail hanging down near his hands. So it most likely that would be a lamb, which would make perfect sense iconographically if we think of the association of Jesus as the Lamb of God, an offering of a lamb. And it also makes sense sort of in the sort of bustling background scene that we have going on here. Because let me go back, see if I can find there's our full scene. One of the things that we also noticed, and I had noticed a little of, but noticed even more in the terms of this discussion, I was sitting sort of down to the lower right below our ambiguous St. Joseph. And someone had asked, what kind of space are we in? Are we actually in a stable? How come there are all of these people in the stable? And we talked for a moment about, can we see where spaces begin and end? Do they make logical sense? And one person, Joe, mentioned that there's a gap at the lower left-hand bottom that doesn't make a lot of sense. There's like an open sort of chasm at the lower left-hand part of the picture. As we move past the Virgin Mary, something I tell you I had never noticed before is that I noticed that there is a railing behind her. All the time I've been looking at this painting, I never noticed that there is a physical boundary separating our St. Joseph, the Virgin Mary, the man in brown, the serving person, separating them from the guy who has the burden flung over his shoulder. I had always seen the two upright verticals on the left. I mean, I understood we were under some sort of an awning. We see straw coming down. I just always assumed it was sort of open to the road behind. And that shows that I was not looking closely enough, because our painter Fiammingo has very clearly showed where the precinct of what is happening in the religious story goes up to here, and beyond it is the life of the town, the life of the city. So we have this gentleman with the burden thrown over his shoulder, the man next to him with the cap. We have a group of 4 other people behind the ambiguous St. Joseph, who might be men or women. We were discussing about that. I noticed, again for the first time, that one member of that group of 4 has what appears to be a staff in his hand. Someone might be gesturing, giving directions. And I noticed too that the space keeps going. It's very ambiguous once you get past the next building, but there's another open doorway and it keeps going beyond that and beyond that. And we come back to this idea of, is this the adoration of the shepherds, plural? Looking at the man, not the man who's carrying the sheep, the lamb, but the man to his left. I see a soft hat and I see a stick, a walking stick, a cane, something. In the group on the right in the middle ground, I see a man, looks like he has a beard, holding a walking stick. And looking at the full painting, the man in brown, I see a soft cloth cap and I see a walking stick. Are there three shepherds here? Is it that only the man in brown has actually made it into the stables to pay respect to the Christ child? Does he have other compatriots who are following along and are caught up in conversation with the townspeople? Perhaps they're not part of a group. Perhaps it's individual shepherds who are coming separately. Perhaps they're not shepherds at all. We got into a bit of a discussion about, how much can we really see of the clothing that the people are wearing in that middle ground area to figure out, are they part of the biblical scene? Are they part of the contemporary miraculous viewers? I don't think the artist has made it perfectly clear. And one thing that certainly supports is that it keeps us looking at the painting. Because if we think of a painting like this one as one potentially designed for a church, where the painter has to know that the viewers of it are going to be the parishioners who will see it not once for 30 minutes, but they'll see it weekly, years, decades, an entire lifetime, depending on when it's installed and how long those people are around and when a new painting might go up in its place. They've got to do something to sort of keep you looking. The idea that the presumption on the part of Fiammingo is that all of us are Christian viewers looking at this painting together. We would know these stories. We would be ready to suss out small details and connect it to our devotional practice. On the other hand, if we are 16th century viewers, it might be very pleasing to us to see this religious narrative take place in a world that looks like ours, that is populated by people who look like they could be the grocer of our town village or something like that. And that even the shepherd who is paying homage to baby Jesus in the foreground looks like he could be someone from your village or from your town. And in this, it's perhaps significant that our artist, Fiammingo, comes from Flanders. He comes from Northern Europe, from a tradition where the depiction of very recognizable everyday life was already embedded in the art that they're making. And although he lives in Venice, he's giving us here really a picture that looks very homey, very lived in, not an idealized depiction of where this religious scene might be taking place. Just opening up the chat here. Jane says, going back to the person with the basket, Bethlehem means house of bread. Ooh, okay, I did not know that. Point one for bread in the basket as opposed to wine. That is great to know. Let's see, anything else I'm forgetting to mention from our discussion in the gallery, which again, so much fun because, the idea of discussing, well, how come you're calling it Adoration of the Shepherds if you've only got one shepherd? Maybe we've got more than one shepherd. I will say the same visitor had suggested you should just call it the Adoration, nothing after that. And I was like, anything's possible. As I said, this isn't a title that Fiammingo wrote on the back of the canvas, so it leaves room for some of those sort of interpretive slipping between the two things. I mentioned in terms of ambiguity, we have this ambiguity of what is at the bottom left-hand part of the screen, this sort of hole, this sort of gap. And that was remarked on by one of our visitors. And at the time I said, you've perfectly segued into something that I wanted to introduce. And it wasn't something that you could immediately see just from looking at the painting, but it does tell us something about how, as a museum, we gain new knowledge about our artworks. And sometimes it happens totally, seemingly, at random. So what you're seeing on screen is a drawing, a very small drawing, that we received an image of via email a couple of years ago from a collector in Italy who said, I just purchased this drawing at an auction. This person was a collector of drawings, and I think it's the preparatory drawing for your painting. Except, if we put them side by side, you might notice that there's a bit of a discrepancy between the painting and the preparatory drawing. Now, most of the figures are there. We see the kneeling gentleman, the baby, the Virgin Mary, the ambiguous Joseph, the background characters. Everything is there in that little drawing, but there's also more in the drawing that we don't see in the painting. In fact, there is a whole bottom quarter of the painting that would appear to be missing if we're taking the drawing as an indication. And there's an entire person, someone with a basket, who's placing it at the top of a flight of stairs, looking at the baby, sort of joining in on observing this sacred moment. Not there. So this person who had contacted us had said, well, do you think it's possible that your painting was cut down? Have you ever looked at the bottom edge of the canvas to see if it's ragged? So we checked the conservation record. There was never any indication about anyone noticing anything unusual about the bottom edge of the canvas. And very helpfully, the same collector said, oh, well, did you know that there's a copy of your painting in a museum in Trento in northern Italy? No, we didn't know that. She said, did you know that your painting was copied in a 17th century engraving? Did not know that either. So just at this one fell swoop, all of this new information about our Kress painting falls into our lap. So on the left, a painted copy, fairly, I would say, of mediocre quality, but including all of the elements that we've just seen, but painted with nothing like the painterly touch of Fiammingo, very sort of clear and straightforward, which perhaps for our purposes is very helpful. Doesn't really tell me whether that's bread up there in the basket, but you know what? We're going to go with bread because of Jane's observation. So we have the painting on the one hand, and then we have in mirror orientation, because of the nature of printmaking and engraving, showing much the same. So that would seem to suggest that our painting was indeed at some point in its history trimmed. And if you're wondering, well, why would that ever happen? We'll probably would never know, but could be that there was damage to the bottom portion of the canvas and they wanted to save the part that was undamaged. It's also quite possible that at some point an owner had a square shaped area they wanted to fill with a painting, and they decided to adapt a painting they owned to fit the space. And I say that because we know that our contemporary attitudes toward artistic preservation and conservation, those are very recent attitudes. And it was not uncommon in the past for an owner of an artwork, no matter how old it was, to feel that they could adapt it, change it, update it to suit what their needs or expectations might have been. There was one other thing that we could do to see if there was any more information on whether, in fact, our painting might have been altered. And I was able to demonstrate this in person in the gallery, but I did my best to take some photographs this morning. And that is, we took our painting and we turned the lights off, and then we turned on an ultraviolet flashlight. Ultraviolet light will not penetrate a painting surface, but what it will show is on the painting surface, are there areas of retouching, places where paint was lost and a conservator has gone in and very carefully filled in the gaps with something like watercolor, just enough to make it not obvious to our eyes that there is paint missing. That's very common. Honestly, most paintings of any significant age are going to have some sort of wear and tear on them that a conservator will have carefully retouched. And by modern conservation ethics, everything that a conservator does is ideally going to be something that is removable in the future without any damage to the painting. So if, for example, it is discovered that retouching was done in error, or the color is wrong, or God forbid, the materials they're using are actually negatively affecting the original paint, the idea is you should be able to roll back those retouchings without any damage at all. And ultraviolet light can show us where those retouchings happen. This is not exactly how it looked when we were in the gallery. You're seeing a red glare, which is sort of where the beam of my UV light is hitting the canvas. You see sort of a purplish glow at the bottom. The painting, when you strike it with ultraviolet light, will have sort of a dull blue glow to it. Most the pigments used in oil paints will, as they say, autoluminesce. They'll sort of glow on their own under black light. The exception will be retouchings, which will not autoluminesce and will instead show up as dark spots. So if we look at the shoulder of the Virgin Mary, you'll see a cluster of dark areas. Those are areas that have been retouched. Above the head of baby Jesus, you see sort of a slash. That is an area that has been retouched. Now, for our purposes, what is interesting is that there is a big muddy area that shows up in ultraviolet near the ambiguous St. Joseph and a little bit further to the left, past sort of directly underneath his knee, which if we compare that to the drawing, we see that that is where someone in the past likely painted over the head and the basket of this figure that was once occupying the lower right-hand corner of the painting. So you have to imagine the scene. If you, for some reason, had to or wanted to cut off a portion of the canvas, they must have thought that, oh, it doesn't make sense to have a head in a basket sort of peeking into the frame. We're just going to cover it up. And because those retouchings are older than the ones done to the shoulder and the ones done above the baby's head, they don't seem quite as dark and quite as sharp. So that's as far. I'm not a conservator by any means, but I've seen conservators deploy this method, and that is at the level that I can share it with visitors. It's always really cool to do. Again, it is not something that penetrates the surface like infrared or X-ray. And indeed, the collector of the drawing on the right did ask us, well, have you ever done infrared reflectography on your painting to see if the underdrawing is present, to really see if you could match it to the drawing that she had purchased? And unfortunately, we don't have the technology at the museum to do infrared reflectography. And since the painting is in largely excellent condition, it's not likely that it's going to wind up in a conservation studio in the near future, the people who might have the technology to perform that. So that will probably remain a mystery. And just going over to our chat here, Tom says, the group of four in the background to the right looks like the three Graces in the painting of the Primavera by Botticelli. Oh, what a nice observation. Hold on. Let's go back to somewhere where I can actually see those people. Oh, interesting. I see the sort of dancer-like position of this gentleman in the calf, the hand extended outward. And, it's absolutely true that artists are always, they're always quoting other artists. I have no idea if Fiammingo had been to Florence, if he was familiar with the Primavera. But since you mentioned that, Tom, the figure in yellow, because of the sort of strange contorted pose, what it always put me in mind of is how many Renaissance artists were aware of the fantastic contortions that Michelangelo had done with the human body in sculpture and in painting, which inspired and challenged so many other artists to be like, well, I can do that too. I can do sort of crazy positions. And again, I don't know that Fiammingo, who again had come from Northern Europe and wound up in Venice, how much exposure did he have to the work of Central and Southern Italian artists? But certainly he is drawing on and absorbing all of the other rich artistic tradition of the paintings that are in Venice. And I skipped over one slide in my haste, and that is the slide that tells us exactly how little we know about the origins of this painting, or rather its location between when it was created in Venice in the 16th century and when it wound up at Fairfield. And the answer is we really know very little. On September 1st, 1939, famous in world history separately as the day the Nazis invaded Poland and began World War II, Samuel H. Kress bought this painting from a collector in Florence whose name was Alessandro Contini Bonacosi. Its collection, the Stroganoff collection, is sort of an assumption prior to that, but we really don't know. The first concrete data point we have about this object is the day it gets sold to American collector Samuel H. Kress, who will donate it to the National Gallery of Art, which he helped found in 1939. It will later leave the National Gallery of Art, and in 1962, it is gifted to the museum in Bridgeport that I mentioned, and then it winds up at Fairfield University and becomes part of the founding collection of our University Art Museum. So it's incredible that such a gorgeous painting, which was evidently well known enough in the 16th century to not only be copied in paint, but to be reproduced in engraving, and yet we know nothing about its location. But maybe we will learn more, because one of the wonderful things that the internet can do, this collector who had bought this drawing, she knew about our painting because our collections are accessible online through our collections database. And the fact that this is being live streamed and will go up on our YouTube channel, perhaps it will reach someone who may somehow have documentation of one of the previous owners of this painting that will shed a little bit more light. If we are ever able to discover who commissioned it, we may know the identity of the man in brown. Perhaps we'll find a documentary bit of evidence that will prove once and for all whether the gentleman at the right is in fact St. Joseph or is a particularly well-dressed shepherd. But till then, we will have to live with some ambiguity in some of the things we don't know. And Tom also says, I vote for the person with the basket of bread on their head as a woman because she has a bun of hair behind her head. I agree with you, Tom. And part of that just comes from exposure to lots of Renaissance paintings and ones that depict sort of serving women. And the way this person is dressed matches very well with the hair and the clothing with depictions of women in those paintings. But it is always fun to have these kinds of, disagreements. exchanges of ideas in front of a painting or virtually online, because they remind us that there's always more to see. And with that, we're going to close our final Art in Focus of 2025. We hope to see you either in person or virtually in spring 2026. And as a reminder, you can always find this and other interesting content from the museum on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you next year.